I'm Ariana Brocious.
I'm Greg Dalton.
And this is Climate One.
So, Ariana, this weird thing happened to me. I got a notice in the mail, your homeowner's insurance is canceled.
Oh no, canceled? What happened?
Well, I live in a wildfire risk area north of San Francisco. It's a wooded rural area, and there's been a lot of fires. And the company said it's too risky, so they canceled.
Man, we've heard about that happening. We've talked about that a lot on the show, but it's one thing to read it. It's another thing to have it happen to you.
It's a big trend in the American West and California and the Sierras. And I wasn't surprised. I was like, oh, okay. Now I've experienced it, what we've been talking about.
Yeah, so what'd you do?
Called my insurance broker, made some changes to the area around my home, reduced the fuel load, and got a policy that's much more expensive.
That's a lot to have to deal with. And honestly, it's something increasing numbers of people are going to have to face because we're seeing these climate impacts hit all around the country in many different ways, right? There's wildfires, as you mentioned, extreme flooding, there's sea level rise, storms, and all those things are really threatening some of these places that many Americans have called home for a long time. So it's forcing a lot of people to consider the question of how long they can remain where they live now. And it's not an easy question to answer. Greg, have you ever thought about moving?
Sure. I live in the Bay Area, which is often seen as a destination for climate migration. People are expected to move here because of the moderate Mediterranean climate. And yet I still have these fantasies of, where am I going to flee? Where am I going to go? I live in a pretty safe place. And I have these, fear impulses of like, what's a safer place?
Yeah, I think about that too. I live in the Southwest and there's just this persistent threat of water shortage, right? And drought, which go hand in hand. And I have these sort of half serious, half joking conversations with friends and family quite often, more often now, about, what are we going to do when the water runs out? And I think there's sort of a limit to the time left for me here, which makes me really sad because this is a place I grew up. I feel a real connection to the desert landscape. This is the place I want to be. But I don't know. I don't know if I'll be able to be here in 40 years.
A lot of people wrestle with this and go through quite an emotional roller coaster. I remember I had a conversation with lawyer and climate justice organizer Colette Pichon-Battle. She said that she made the decision to stay in her community in Louisiana despite the climate risk of living in that area.
I intend to stay on the land that my people are from. We've been on that land since before it was the United States. And if there's one Pichon left standing, it'll be me.
And this is something we're going to dig into on the show today because the question of whether you even can move or want to move is at the heart of climate migration, right? There's a lot of privilege, wealth, ability tied up in people even considering the question of moving. And in addition to the movement that we're expecting to see within our own country's borders, there's also going to be millions of people moving across borders. And that migration is becoming a central issue in lots of elections, including ours.
Right. It's a big issue in the U.S. election. Border crossings are up to near all-time highs or at all-time highs, depending on the data that you look at. And we've seen this in other countries lead to right-wing governments in many countries around the world. Italy, Spain, the Netherlands. It was part of Brexit. And I discussed that later in the episode with author Sonia Shah.
First, we're going to dig into the mechanics and the push and pull factors of this big pending climate migration with Abrahm Lustgarten. He's an investigative reporter with ProPublica and author of a new book called On the Move, The Overheating Earth and the Uprooting of America. We talked about this idea of a human niche and how it's shrinking.
There is a human biodiversity niche on the planet that for the better part of the last 6,000 years, people have tended to live on the planet within a certain range of temperatures and precipitation. And this is just like studying, where certain plants grow best in different environments. And what the studies have found is that the niche is moving, that with climate change, it's shifting in a way that is going to leave large segments of the planet's population outside of it. So in North Africa, for example, where the largest concentration of global population now sits just slightly inside that niche, as the niche moves northward, hundreds of millions, if not billions of people will slip outside of what has been the most traditional habitable part of the planet for the last 6,000 years. And that niche is moving all around the world. And as it does, it's displacing people from those normal conditions. Around 3 billion people by 2070, according to these two studies that were published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And it doesn't suggest that all 3 billion of those people will move, but it does suggest that all 3 billion of those people will face that kind of decision, will be experiencing a degradation in their environment, and will be living in a place that hasn't traditionally supported human life, and will have to make a decision about what to do with it.
And a corresponding percentage of the Earth that we inhabit now will become less habitable, uninhabitable in some cases. It's quite a lot, right? It's like 20%?
Yeah. So when the first study was published a couple of years ago, it was about 1% of the planet's population currently lived in a place that was traditionally less habitable outside of the niche. And by 2070, the researchers project that it will be 19% of the planet's population.
So the pace and frequency of climate impacts has begun to speed up, maybe intensify in recent years. People are seeing more of these impacts in their daily lives. Still, I think that a lot of listeners think, it won't get that bad where I live. But you write, quote, climate reality has repeatedly outpaced climate predictions. So where can we see that?
Well, we see it the last couple of summers in the extreme heat waves that are hitting the United States or Europe, or one headline after another about the rate of sea ice that's melting. I mean, we just saw headlines this week about, the possibility that the Arctic will be ice-free within a decade or so. These are things that were thought to be much further out into the future just a couple of years ago. And it's kind of like at every turn, at every headline, we're learning in some way that things are either more severe than they were anticipated to be, or happening faster than they're anticipated to be. And, how we experience that change is relative. Around the world, the United States doesn't have it as bad off as many places that are really kind of in the bullseye of change, and also less equipped to handle that change. But we are still experiencing that change here, and it's still extremely disruptive. And that's really been, the focus of the book work, was to think about, well, how is that moving niche going to affect Americans as, relative as that change is? How are we going to experience it here, and what are we going to do in response to it?
So, speaking of Americans, we've been incentivized to live in some of the riskiest parts of the country, the coasts notably, and some of the Southwest, where it's very hot and already been arid and water stressed for forever. Can you explain some of the policies and strategies that subsidize risk in places that are already suffering from sea level rise, extreme storms, drought, and water shortage?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a big focus of my reporting, is to try to understand why Americans live where they do. When elsewhere around the world, people they make logical decisions. If it's really hot or it's really dry, there's usually less people that live in those places. And that's not the case in the United States. And so I set out to understand that, and identified a number of perverse incentives that have encouraged people to live in some of the most at-risk sea level rise places in the country, some of the places that are flooding fastest, and also some of the hottest and driest. And the biggest example of that is the way that private property insurance is sold in the United States. We all, as homeowners, or every building owner or property owner, buys insurance to protect them in the case of disaster. And as those disasters have gotten more and more severe, in Florida in particular, the free market insurance companies have backed out of those markets, which is logical. They don't want to pay, to insure that risk. And so after Hurricane Andrew in 1992, Florida saw this as really a monumental threat to their economic growth and to their hopes for development and building new homes and new buildings along the beaches and coasts. So they set out to subsidize that insurance, and they created a state-run plan called a FAIR program that essentially guarantees insurance to people who can't buy it through the private market. And that program has ballooned in size in Florida, and it's been replicated in other states, including Louisiana and Texas and 29 or 30 other states all the way up the East Coast. And California has a version of it that's protecting homeowners against wildfire. And it's really become sort of a de facto method of providing insurance for people who could lose their insurance in the face of environmental risk. But as it does that, it also hides the economic signal of climate change.
Right.
They basically make it seem like it's cheaper or less riskier to take a risk than it actually is.
This whole thread in the book you tie in with kind of this American culture of boosterism, even back when Western settlers were coming in and taking land from indigenous people. But there was this idea that, you could make it. And there's kind of been this promise of place that is really entrenched, I think, in the American identity. And in spite of what we see or experience, people want to rebuild, people want to stay where they are. You get at this complexity that all of us experience, which is the identity you have, the place you call home, how much it means to you, your community, and how hard it is, even in the face of obvious risks, to leave.
Yeah, I mean, I portray it as a human dilemma. I really think it is a human dilemma. I mean, we can read all the statistics and the scientific facts and the political arguments that we want, but in the end, it is what you say. It's a very personal decision. It's something that we all have to deal with, and it's something that I deal with personally. I mean, I started this project because I live in Northern California, in a place that's at risk from wildfires, and I'm probably one of those people that place matters to a little more than average. I choose where I live by how beautiful it is, by its proximity to the mountains and water and these things that I value. And I've always thought of that as a free choice and a subjective choice. And the more I learn, I've had to, consider what my own risks are, wildfire risk among them, and what I want to do in response to those. And I've had moments, as I know that, so many other Americans do, of thinking I have to move, I have to protect myself, or I have to protect my assets or my savings or my children's future and all of those things. And moments where the countervailing forces of what I want, even in the face of all this evidence, it really just outweighs what might be a more logical or more pragmatic decision. And so I sort of recognize in that, and so many of the people that I talk to in writing my book, are in the same position, that this is not an easily reconcilable circumstance. I don't pretend that there's, a right answer or a prescriptive solution that my book or that this conversation can impose on people.
Yeah, I have a similar connection to my place, which is, the desert Southwest. It's been a challenge to live here since people have lived here. And, I can feel critical of the numbers of people that continue to move to Phoenix every year and feel like they're threatening, the limited supplies we have. But I'm also not moving. I'm staying here. I'm putting down roots, and it's a place that I love and I don't want to leave. But it's becoming more common to have those conversations with my friends and my family about, we kind of joke about when the water's going to run out, but there is truth, real truth in that. So models suggest that over the next 50 to 70 years, at least 13 million Americans, maybe as many as 162 million, could move in response to changes in their climate. Most will move north in the U.S. or into cities or both. I would like to talk a bit about the demographics of this shift as you understand it. You write that younger people, families, and job seekers will be the first to leave, while aging populations and the poor might be left behind or trapped in place.
Yeah. So first, I would just want to clarify that we don't know how many people will move in the United States. And we're looking for a range. And none of the models that I use or that any of the researchers I talk to use can predict how many people will move. So the 13 million is the low end of a spectrum. It's how many people are expected to be displaced by changes in our coastlines, by coastal flooding. And, we talked about how difficult a personal decision that is, whether to move. It's a lot easier to make if your house is underwater. So that's considered a starting point for how small could that number be. 160 million is the number of Americans that the research suggests will slide outside of that human habitability niche, which is to say that, for about half of Americans, there will be a noticeable decrease in the quality of their environment related to climate change, and they'll be slipping closer and closer to circumstances that were not supportive of human life for 6,000 years. So we can imagine that some portion of those will move. Whether the number turns out to be 13 million or 25 million or 100 million, we really have no idea. But we also know that mobility is a factor of ability, is a factor of relative wealth, relative youth, and energy. That's borne out in research around the world looking at migratory patterns, and it's borne out in demographic research in the United States. So when we look at the number of Americans that might be affected and the way that populations tend to move, the research suggests that we'll see 10 to tens of millions of Americans, probably younger and or wealthier ones, moving away from what I looked at in the book as kind of the primary risks, geographic risks facing the United States. And those are wildfires and coastal flooding and extreme heat, a decline in crop viability, crop yields, and agricultural production. all of those things are less of a threat in the northern part of the country and in the Northeast in particular than they are in the South and the Southwest. And that's not to say that those destination regions don't face plenty of climate risks of their own. They certainly do, but they have ample water. They won't face the same kind of extreme heat, and they're relatively shielded from some of these, most obvious climate risks. And so no one knows for sure what's going to happen, but all of those signs point to a shift in population, both towards large cities and then generally northward and northeastward.
We're going to take a quick break. Coming up, what does it take for a city to absorb hundreds, maybe even thousands of new residents?
We're not looking for magical climate solutions here. We're looking for an abundance of grocery stores that have high quality food and good transportation.
That's up next.
Please help us get people talking more about climate by sharing this episode with a friend. And we'd love to know what you think of the show. Please give us a rating or review. You can do it right now on your device, and it really helps people find the show. Thanks.
This is Climate One. I'm Ariana Brocious. When people leave an area due to climate change, they have to find a home someplace else. Some cities see the changing climate as a sort of opportunity. Places that were once seen as less desirable, or maybe even a bit boring, may be the new hotspots, so to speak. One of those cities is Duluth, Minnesota. 2 years ago, a Harvard professor singled out Duluth as a destination for future climate migrants. Locals were skeptical at first. Then, new neighbors started showing up. And as Dan Kraker of Minnesota Public Radio reports, more are looking to come.
Duluth native Karen Pagel-Gerndt remembers when she first heard about Duluth as a potential climate change refuge. It was January, and it was 20 below zero.
To me, the whole idea of climate migration for folks coming here, it kind of made me laugh.
Pagel-Gerndt is a real estate agent in Duluth. When climate adaptation professor Jesse Keenan traveled to Duluth to pitch his idea for the city to playfully market itself as climate-proof Duluth, the media loved it. The New York Times did a big story, CNN came here, and not long afterwards,
I started hearing from people, from clients from the two coastal areas, mostly East Coast and West Coast, of saying, what is this place called Duluth, and what is your weather really like here?
Pagel-Gerndt sold a house to a couple from Colorado who cited climate change as their chief reason for moving, and then to a couple from Salt Lake City who wanted to escape air pollution caused by increasingly severe wildfire seasons. That's also what brought Jamie Alexander and her family to Duluth. In 2018, the Camp Fire killed 85 people in Northern California, burned thousands of homes, and filled the air with thick smoke.
The air quality in San Francisco was in the hazardous category for 2 weeks straight, and just had considerable health impacts on my kids, one of my kids in particular.
So when the pandemic hit in 2020 and another bad wildfire season was forecast, Alexander's family hopped in their camper van and landed in Duluth. At first, they just intended to stay the summer.
And then ride out wildfire season here and then go back. And we just fell in love with it here. And 2020 in California was so horrible for, the air quality.
So they decided to make the move permanent. They bought a house right on Lake Superior.
I did get into paddleboarding this summer, which is not something I ever expected I would do, but it's pretty amazing.
Jesse Keenan, the climate adaptation researcher who's at Tulane University now, says it's important to distinguish between people who are displaced by climate-related disasters and people who are reevaluating where they want to live because of climate or other factors.
There is a cohort of Americans who have the means, the resources, and they have the elective mobility to be on the move.
That creates an opportunity for a city like Duluth, where the population of 86,000 has barely budged over the past few decades. But it also creates challenges. Duluth already has a housing shortage, and welcoming more newcomers will mean a need for more homes and apartment buildings. That can sometimes create pushback from locals, says Adam Fulton, Duluth's Director of Planning and Economic Development.
Well, I think anytime you have community change, it's always tricky. And for the people who are experiencing that change, it's often very difficult.
There isn't any data to show how many people are actually moving because of climate change, only anecdotal stories. But Doug Koma thinks the number will grow.
I think Duluth as a climate migration hub is already a thing. I think we're just starting to recognize it. And I think 2, 3, 5 years from now, it's going to be widely known, far and wide. That's what I think.
The 47-year-old moved here from Sonoma County in California after dealing first with wildfires and then flooding that forced him from his home for several days. He knew he wanted to move to the Midwest, where he has family.
And I actually created a little spreadsheet for myself because I'm that sort of analytical nerd, where I created criteria and assigned points to those criteria.
Duluth rose to the top, he says, because of its outdoor beauty and growing creative community. And he says he knows several other Californians who have already moved to Duluth or are considering it. But for prospective migrants, Koma has a warning. Even with climate change, winters in Duluth are still long and still cold. For Climate One, I'm Dan Kraker in Duluth.
A version of that story originally aired on Minnesota Public Radio. Duluth may be excited to welcome new climate refugees, but other places are more wary. They're already struggling to accommodate existing residents, and the influx of new people strains resources even further. I talked about that with reporter Abrahm Lustgarten. He's been tracking the impacts of climate migration, both the relief it offers and the new challenges it can create.
There's just simply a tension between, the possibilities that come with growth and the opportunity for growth, and then the friction that comes with large communities shifting where they are and interacting with new communities. And so there's just a wide range of how this is viewed and what may happen. And cities in the Northeast in particular, many of them, especially around the Rust Belt, have what planners I talk to describe as quote unquote capacity. So they're past their heyday. They have extra infrastructure and housing stock and maybe public transit and sewer systems that are built to handle a larger population than they currently have. And so that's one easy opportunity to absorb more people. And some cities are embracing this and reaching out to recruit potential climate migrants or just people who want to move in general. So, the city of Buffalo, New York, for example, is marketing itself as a climate haven. Similar things in planning documents for Vermont, which for a time was paying people who wanted to move from out of state to move to Vermont and work remotely. And there's a lot of research that suggests that there's a lot of opportunity in those receiving communities. I cite, a paper from Stanford researcher Marshall Burke that looks at, the economic impacts of climate change. And most of his research is focused on how bad it's going to be for a lot of the world. But the flip side of his data is how good it could be for some parts of the world. And those parts of the world include the northern United States and, Canada, Scandinavia, Russia, where he projects that GDP could grow as the climate changes. But the flip side of all this is friction and tension. And unfortunately, what we see in a lot of places around the world is that, migrants aren't always welcome or not welcomed for long, in the places where they wind up. And, we see that with Central Americans moving through Mexico, enormous sympathy for the first couple thousand people that show up, and then, heightening tensions and bias and ultimately a rejection of people once those numbers grow, to be much, much larger than a couple thousand people.
Yeah, even the words migrant and refugee for many people, draw up certain kinds of images and feelings that can begin from a place of maybe empathy and compassion and then, turn into something different. We've seen that. One thing you write about that I found fascinating is that there might be parallels in this future migration with the great migration we saw of African Americans out of the American South, and that migration, while complicated and not wholly good, of course, for those involved, had a profound impact on American culture all throughout the country, and that there are these positive reverberations that continue today, right, of all of this shift that happened. So what are some of the projections that you've read about or that, people are thinking about with this transformation that might be coming?
Yeah, the lesson I think is that, change can be good. And what those past migrations were periods of enormous and rapid cultural change. Right, so we saw 6 to 7 million African Americans migrating out of the South between 1915 and 1980 or something like that, and that migration was extreme. I mean, trains were full, roadways were full. There was no place to sleep often in the cities where those people arrived, Philadelphia and Baltimore and Detroit, places like that. But, with a little bit of time and some programs that helped to receive those people and lots of programs to help employ those people and take advantage of that larger labor base as well, communities assimilated and they blended together, and opportunities arose in so many ways that have really come to define our American culture today, integrating essentially the culture of African American life with the culture of predominantly white life in the Northeast and in places like Los Angeles as well. So, so much of what we identify with in terms of our musical heritage, our literary heritage, sports and arts is a result of that cultural transformation that happened during that era.
So ultimately, you and many other researchers you interviewed arrive at somewhat of the same conclusion that ideally, to handle this projected massive transformation and migration that we're going to see, we need coordinated high-level planning and design that will prioritize equity, help cities plan, help people move. Is any of that happening?
Some of it actually is happening. When I began this project, the answer would have been no. With the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, we see, a lot more money going towards the types of things that are necessary and will help. And it's a really, great start that gives me some optimism. What we're talking about needing are the same things that we have always needed. So we're really just talking about how do you plan cities for rapid growth? And that growth could come from a whole lot of different things. In this case, it's going to come, I believe, from, climate-driven migration and demographic change in the United States. But we're not looking for magical climate solutions here. We're looking for an abundance of grocery stores that have high quality food and good transportation to get people around cities like Atlanta so they can get to work, or homes that are planned in a way that they have great insulation and won't cost a fortune to live in when the heat is too hot or the cold is too cold. So really sort of like basic infrastructure, and that stuff requires money and planning and jobs and strong communities. And we can do that. And acts like the Inflation Reduction Act, are a great example of an enormous amount of money that's being pumped into some of those investments, not just in the North, but in the South, and, electric vehicle battery plants in Georgia.
Right. It's not hard to think about a future where we become increasingly siloed by wealth and ability to insulate ourselves against the natural environment as these conditions change, right? And that there'll be kind of these little eco cities that perhaps are well prepared to handle whatever climate threats come their way, but they're expensive and you have to, live in a glass tower, a bubble to protect yourself. And then there will be people who are not able to do that, right? I mean, it seems a little dystopian, but also highly possible.
It's totally dystopian. I mean, the pessimistic view from many of the climate experts I talk to is that we can wind up in a situation just like you described, where we have islands or pockets of wealth and safety. And that's because the people who had a lot of money either were the first to move to a safe place and gentrified that place in the process, or because they can afford to build walls or protections or literal seawalls around them. And so our challenge is to, if we can foresee that, is to not fall into that trap. And not just because it's the right thing to do, morally, but because that pattern, also forecasted by climate researchers and experts around the world, is only going to increase adversity and tension and ultimately conflict. And that conflict is going to, spread a wider stability that's going to be, a threat to the United States and a threat to peace around the world. And the challenge then has to be, how can you have the foresight to protect people in a more equitable way and not let those kind of islands of isolation be an organic result of this process, because there was no planning for it.
And that kind of growing inequality can also lead to increased extremism among some groups. I know you've been doing a little research on how extremist groups in the U.S. are reacting to current climate-induced disasters. Can you touch on that just a bit?
Yeah, this is a teaser for future work. And it's basically, the pressures of climate change are having all sorts of effects. They're affecting our communities physically, like we're talking about, but they're affecting collectively our political views and our social needs. And so, there is a response to that among people who would like to see less immigration into the United States. So it affects border policy, for example, fears of climate-driven migration on the border. And it pops up in other ways too. So I've noticed how right-wing groups, militia groups are using climate-driven disasters, for example, as recruiting opportunities. They'll go and provide aid after a disaster, a hurricane in Florida, for example, and they'll demonstrate to a community that there's a non-governmental entity that can be really effective in taking trees off your roof or, helping evacuate or things like that. And once that disaster passes, they've ingratiated themselves into that community and they use it as a recruitment tool. So there's both a sense that they can take advantage of these changing circumstances, but also, a sense that the changes themselves are becoming too plain to deny.
You write a bit about your own sort of new routine of having a go bag in the summer or wildfire season and being ready to evacuate, which is something a lot of Californians have gotten used to and is scary to contemplate. What's the roller coaster that you've been on in terms of should I stay, should I go, should I move, your connection to place, and what's still unresolved for you?
Everything's unresolved for me. I mean, I began this book project specifically because of my personal experience. I began it in a year when Northern California faced extraordinary wildfires. Some of them were really, really close to my house, and we were all, sort of walking around in a stupor of smoke with our windows closed and our air purifiers going, and being on alert for possible, in my community, for possible evacuation. And I write in the book about, a woman named Ellen Hurdell, who has a very similar experience to mine in Sonoma County, and she reflects a lot of the same experience. And so the research evolved out of this incredibly unsettled feeling of both wondering how everybody else is thinking about this challenge, and also just wanting data and information about, where to go, what's the smart decision, how will it affect my finances. And so a couple of things have happened over the course of that research. One is that the shock of the impact has waned a little bit. I've gotten used to the idea of living in an unstable environment. I guess you could say I'm through the grief stage and I'm into like the adaptation stage.
Acceptance.
So, yeah, some degree of acceptance, right? So I understand the risks. It doesn't make them easier to solve, but they're a little less scary to think about. And so I think about them all the time. And the other thing, and I think this is very natural and affects people everywhere, is that we haven't had that kind of disastrous fire season since the first 2 years or so that I was working on this research. And that removes some of the urgency. And I know that that urgency will come back. All of the studies say that, California will have those years again. And I think about what that's like for people locally around the country whenever they face whatever disaster they're facing, the heat waves in Arizona last year and, hurricanes on the Florida coast. But for me, it's just been a little bit of a reprieve and a little bit of an excuse to think about something else for a little while. And in that time, I've gotten very clear about what I also love and enjoy about where I live and the reasons why it's hard to leave it, which doesn't mean that I never will, but it means that, I'm not quite ready yet. And so I'm in, this state of limbo, realizing that I'm not going to pack up and flee immediately, but that I might not be able to stay where I would otherwise choose to stay for the rest of my life.
Abrahm Lustgarten is a reporter with ProPublica and author of On the Move, The Overheating Earth and the Uprooting of America. Thank you so much for joining us on Climate One and sharing these stories and your personal journey with us.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Coming up, how reframing large-scale migration can change our responses to it.
The crisis is not that they have migrated. The crisis is a crisis of welcome. It's the fact that the people who are in these host societies don't want them.
We'll be right back.
We know climate migration is happening all over the country and the world. So we asked you, our listeners, how it's impacting your own thinking about whether to stay or go. One of the people we heard from was Farhan.
I'm an ICU doctor, and I moved from Florida to Michigan last year for a job opportunity. However, climate change was a big part of that decision. I was afraid of the future of my home in Florida in regards to extreme heat, sea rise, and increasingly powerful hurricanes. I thought of the possible resilience factors of the Great Lakes region, such as less extreme heat and access to fresh water long term. But boy, was I in for a surprise when I first moved to Michigan. The smoke from the 2023 Canadian wildfires was suffocating my city. That made me hyper aware of something that even as a doctor who primarily deals with hearts and lungs, that I never paid much attention to: air quality. I discovered that the region I migrated to is exposed to a lot of smog from car and industrial infrastructure. Now I find myself debating whether this is the right long-term move for me. The long-term effects of elevated particulate matter and ozone are now in the forefront of my mind. Its relationship to dementia and cardiovascular disease have me thinking about moving again. This just goes to show that no place is immune to the effects of climate change.
It's easy to talk about the need to move or considering a possible move, but actually doing so is a lot harder. Now we're going to go to a place where one community is trying to relocate because of climate threats and hear about how hard that can actually be. Reporter John Ryan of KUOW has this story.
I'm sitting on top of a seawall in the village of Tuhola, Washington. It's too windy up here for standing. This is where the Pacific Ocean meets the Quinault Indian Reservation. One of the highest tides of the year, called the king tide, is hitting the seawall right now. Big waves are crashing into the seawall and occasionally depositing big driftwood logs on top and even into the backyards of tribal members' houses. Days like today also give a sneak peek of the future as an ever hotter climate causes global sea levels to rise.
Hello.
Leah?
Yes.
Hi, I'm John. Leah Frenchman lives on the back side of that seawall with her partner and 2 kids.
It is inevitable that my street will be in the ocean at some point.
Her home and others in the village of 800 people are perched on cinder blocks.
Normally what happens is at high tide in the winters, the waves will come over, my backyard will fill with water, and you'll see the water running under my house out into the street.
When big waves hit the seawall, her home shakes.
It just vibrates like a little mini earthquake constantly for a few hours.
Should a big earthquake hit, most of the village could be inundated by a tsunami.
My kids' schools they're all sea level. They're all in the flooding zone.
In December, the Quinault government reached a milestone in its long push to provide safe housing for its people. Tribal Council member Ryan Hendricks showed me from his pickup truck.
You're looking at about 9 acres of fresh development with asphalt and sidewalks and lots of open space to start building some houses.
The site is on higher ground, about a mile from the lower village.
It's a big project for such a small group of people to take on.
Incomes on the Quinault Reservation are low, about half the national average. Housing is scarce. Tanya Eisen-Polak wanted to move back to Tuhola after she finished grad school studying ocean policy.
I do wish that I could have moved back into the home that I love so much, but I realized that that's not a place that I would feel safe raising a family.
Heat-trapping pollution has raised the world's oceans by about 7 inches over the past century.
We're trying to solve a problem that we didn't create. We didn't create carbon emissions to any level of the outside non-tribal world.
The Quinault government has received millions in state and federal funds to relocate the village. It's spent millions of its own revenue from timber and casino operations. Now the tribe needs hundreds of millions more to get homes built in the new neighborhood.
It's been a long process.
Guy Kapoman is president of the Quinault Indian Nation.
We've had to do a lot of convincing to get some of our folks to agree that, it's best to move up on the hill.
Tribal members, including Kapoman, have mixed feelings about relocating away from the mouth of the Quinault River, the heart of Quinault culture. Kapoman says he hasn't decided whether he'll move away from the lower village.
At my age, I'm 54. The thought of taking on a home loan is something that is, it's a big investment.
Tanya Eisen-Polak says there's a generational divide. It's even fueled tense discussions in her own family about what to do with the family home.
No, Mom, we shouldn't put $15,000 into this because it's going to be washed away.
Leah Frenchman says she's looking forward to moving uphill and saving her family from the rising ocean. Still, she says she'll miss the sounds of the surf and eagles overhead.
I hear them whistling all day. My heart just breaks when I think about not being near that anymore. I know it's at the same time not reasonable and not safe, but it's a hard thing to accept.
The Biden administration has issued grants to tribes in 5 states that are looking to move to higher ground. Even for tribes like the Quinault that have safe uphill space available nearby, it takes a lot of time and effort to move a village. John Ryan, KUOW News.
Thanks to John Ryan and KUOW for sharing that piece with us.
People aren't the only ones traveling long distances in search of new homes, of course. Most animals migrate too, usually seasonally, and they've done so for thousands of years. Those patterns are changing along with hot and weird weather. And that's the subject of The Next Great Migration, a book by Sonia Shah. She asks, what might humans learn from the way animals are responding to this moment?
That was the big question I had when I started doing the research for this book was, I had encountered scientists who were talking about, we need to build corridors for these animals so that they can, get over highways and get through like human infrastructure so they can get into these new places, facilitating animal migrations because of climate change. But then you look at humans moving around and everyone's just totally freaked out about it. We want to pull up the ladders and close the doors and build the walls. And, right now we have more walls and fences on national borders around the world than at any time in the past. When I started this process of trying to figure out why that was, I first looked at all of the kind of, the obvious arguments, right? Like there's like economic problems, there's cultural problems, there's security issues, there's, crime issues, all of these supposed problems of migration come up again and again. And I looked through the social science research, I talked to a lot of people, and almost all of those arguments completely fall apart when you start really looking at them closely.
Historically, migration has been east to west. Now it's more north-south. How is that changing and how is climate related?
Yeah, so many different wild species migrate. And, we're now learning that humans, we are also animals, and we too are migrating in many of the same ways. But biologists who have studied non-humans have figured out that there's actually a formula by which they can kind of predict whether a species or a population or even an individual is likely to migrate. And they've distilled that into what I call a migrant formula, which is essentially if the time it takes you to rear the next generation is longer than the time you expect your habitat to be stable, then it's likely that migration is going to become more common in your group or population or family. That plays out in all different species. So you look at different population of bats, for example, bats that roost in caves as opposed to bats that roost in trees. When they're in trees, they are in a less stable environment than the bats who roost in caves. And bats who roost in trees are indeed more likely to migrate than bats that roost in caves. This is true for all different species. It's true even on a population level, on a family level, as well as on a species level.
So we're learning from the animal world. Humans are animals. So we're making similar calculations. There's a lot of people on the move now. You went to Greece to study human migration. What surprised you about what you found there?
Well, when I went, I actually was thinking this is, there's migration going on. This is time when the Syrian war was triggering just huge flows of people out of Syria, huge flows of people out of Afghanistan, North Africa, and people are trying to get into Europe, especially northern and western parts of Europe, and they're getting stuck in the Mediterranean and the southern countries of Europe as well. And so this so-called migrant crisis was in the papers every day at the time. And I had just written a book about pandemics and infectious diseases. And so I got a grant to do some reporting, and I got several assignments from editors to go write about the potential public health problems triggered by this migrant crisis in the Mediterranean. So when I went to Greece, I was looking for, what are all the things that can go wrong here? I was looking for, are there going to be infectious disease outbreaks? Are they going to bring some new pathogen into these new environments and infect the local people?
So you went in with the mindset, migration is a problem. I'm going to go document the problems.
Exactly. So that was totally my mindset when I went in. And I remember sitting down with one aide doctor in particular, and I mentioned the migrant crisis in my question somehow, like, what are the public health impacts of this migrant crisis? That kind of question. And he said, there is no migrant crisis. And I was like, well, all these people are, stuck in tents. There's politicians are screaming about this every day. It's in the headlines. There's riots in the streets. Like, people are very upset about what's going on. There's all this tumult. Like, there's surely a crisis of some kind, right? And he was like, well, yes, but it's not a crisis of migration. He pointed out that there's plenty of jobs in Greece at the time. There's plenty of housing in Greece. In fact, there was a housing crisis in Greece. There was so much empty housing stock. And there was labor shortages, less so in Greece, but in other parts of Europe at the time. So there's plenty of jobs. There's plenty of housing. There's absorptive capacity in this place where these people have come to. And so the crisis is not that they have moved. The crisis is not that they have migrated. The crisis is a crisis of welcome. It's the fact that the people who are in these host societies don't want them.
So that was a real frame shifting, awakening moment for you.
Totally. I mean, I hadn't really thought about, is it life-saving for the migrants themselves that they move? Could it contribute to the resilience of the societies they leave behind if they move? Is there absorptive capacity in the places that they are moving to? These are like at least 3 of the things you'd want to consider before deciding whether a given migrant crisis is like a net positive or net negative.
Do you accept the narrative that migrant influx, whether some see it a crisis, some not, pushed some countries to the political right in Europe?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a direct line from the migrant crisis that was happening in the Mediterranean and specifically, and the right-wing populist kind of takeover of many different countries, not just in Europe, but here in the United States too, in Philippines, in India, and Brazil. Like, there's all these different countries where populist leaders were pointing to this quote unquote migrant crisis and saying, that's what's going to happen here. You better let me take over and I'm going to close the borders and build the wall.
Certainly in the United States, the right has been saying there's a migration problem for some years. And on the left, and I know you write for The Nation and others, is like, well, it's not so much. It's not a problem. The New York Times reported more than 2.4 million apprehensions in the 2023 fiscal year ending last October, more than any year since 1960 when the U.S. government started collecting data. It is at an all-time high, and yet that's not really recognized on the political left. Would you agree with that? That's downplayed?
I think it is downplayed because people don't want to contribute to this underlying narrative that migration is a problem that we need to solve, as opposed to let's facilitate it so we can capitalize on the positives and minimize the negatives, which is, if you look at migration overall, right? Like, we've been migrating ever since we evolved, ever since we walked out of Africa, we've been moving along. Mm-hmm. We've been moving again and again and again, and not because of a crisis, not because something terrible happened. We didn't run out of food or water or space in Africa, but we left anyway. Migration is very much built into the human experience, and not just us, but all these other species too. So really, I think on the left and the right, there's a tendency to think of migration as, well, this is good. Like, let's just keep it going. Open the faucet. Or, no, this is bad. Let's close the faucet, turn it off. But a third way of looking at migration, which is what I argue for in this book, is to say migration is a reality. It is going to happen. It does happen. It has happened in the past. It's going to continue in the future. We can either turn it into a crisis, so we have this, rolling series of catastrophes again and again and again, or we can manage it, right? We can manage it. So we can minimize the costs and maximize the benefits.
My family came from Ireland and Germany a long time ago. We're all immigrants from some time frame. How did your personal immigrant experience in your family shape your approach to this work?
It very much contributed to the sense that migration is a problem. My parents are immigrants from India. My great grandfathers were I trace the kind of larger migration story of my family to them. They both were from a small fishing village in the western coast of Gujarat in India. And my great grandfathers told their kids they had to marry within the village, within the same sect of the small religion that I'm a part of. And my grandparents did that, but then they also decided to move to the big city. So they both left those fishing villages, went off to the big city, Mumbai for one side and Coimbatore in the south for another side. And then they had my parents, and my parents came of age in the 1960s, and they were doctors at that time, which is when the United States needed a lot of new doctors and engineers because they were expanding Medicare and Medicaid and all these new entitlements programs had come online. And so they did the big jump over the ocean before I was born. And so then I was born in New York City. And when you're born in a country as a kid, like you assimilate really quickly. But of course, there's a whole system of exclusion here in the United States. So I was not accepted as a real American, and I think I attributed that to my immigrant status. Correctly so, right? Like people would say, "Where are you from?" And I would say, "I'm from here." I'm from right here where you are from too. And they would say, "No, no, really, where are you really from?" Which
Yeah,
means,
right.
no, you can't be
Yeah.
from here, really. You must
Yeah, there's that
really be from somewhere else.
that white normalcy, the sort of all-American, blue-eyed, blonde. Yeah. What sort of progress is there around policy providing legal asylum for climate refugees? Does that category even exist?
It doesn't exist. And this is, I think, one of the hugest gaps that we haven't discussed enough in general, which is that there is no legal way for people to cross borders because of climate change. It is always illegal everywhere in the world. And we know people are going to have to move from climate change. People already are moving from climate change, but there's no legal way for them to do that. So they have to say, well, I'm coming here because I'm being persecuted and, try to get refugee status, or they have to try to get immigration status, which, try to get a visa get an employer who actually wants you for some job or something. Or you just, roll the dice and leave and hope that somehow you will get to somewhere where you can make a life for yourself. And this is just like a terrible waste of human capital. Besides like the inhumanity of it, it's just such a waste for society. These are the people who are literally the most motivated, resilient people in their
Yeah.
societies. Do you know?
Think about it. The lazy people don't stay. It's the entrepreneurial people who get up and move and take risk. Great, personal and social risk. They're all entrepreneurs in a sort, right?
They're innovators, they're resilience, they have all the skill. These are the people you want as part of your community. These are the people who build the new businesses and who come up with the new innovations. Like the people who are willing to move, who are taking those risks, those are the survivors. Those are the people who have the resilience and the skills and the innovation that you want those people as part of your society. And we're doing the exact opposite. We're just shutting our doors to them.
I talked to a lot of people. People are thinking about moving, particularly in this political year. People are looking for a plan B outside the United States. Some people, have you thought about moving yourself as someone who studies butterflies and people moving because of climate change?
I have. It's definitely something I think about. It's definitely something I think about for my kids in particular of like, where do we want to kind of land that would be easiest to ride out this next era of disruptive climate changes? And I actually think that, where we are is pretty much okay. Like nowhere is going to be completely immune. Like this is something that's going to happen everywhere.
Yeah, it's
right?
a fallacy to think there's some safe place you can go to that'll be untouched,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. So I don't think that exists. I think what resilience is going to come from is creating connections between people, right? Like you have to know your neighbors so that when the storm comes, you can share that ladder. Or you have to know where your food is grown because when there's wildfires, you need to figure it out and like start over somewhere new. That's the resilience we have always relied on, really, as Homo sapiens, is our sociality, our ability to make connections with each other and cooperate with each other.
Sonia Shah is author of The Next Great Migration, The Beauty and Terror of Life on the Move. Thank you so much, Sonia, for sharing your personal story and the stories of others.
Thanks so much.
On this Climate One, we've been talking about climate migration. You can find links and more information in the show notes on our website, climateone.org. While you're there, subscribe to our weekly newsletter to get a preview of next week's episode and a look at the biggest stories in the world of climate.
Talking about climate can be hard, and it's critical to address the transitions we need to make across all parts of society. You can help us get more people talking about climate by giving us a rating or review. It also helps us know what you think of the show, and it helps others find it. If you like what you hear, consider joining us on Patreon and supporting the show that way.
Brad Marshland is our senior producer. Our managing director is Jenny Park. Ariana Brocious is co-host, editor, and producer. Austin Colon is producer and editor. Megan Basilia is our production manager. Wency Shada is our development manager. Ben Testani is our communications manager. Jenny Lawton is consulting producer. Our theme music was composed by George Young. Gloria Duffy and Philip Young are co-CEOs of the Commonwealth Club World Affairs, the nonprofit and nonpartisan forum where our program originates. I'm Greg Dalton.